We had a few technical difficulties. Sorry about that, as you can tell. So I am Liddell Zellers, and I am chairing this Plan Commission meeting. Oh, good. Now it shows it up as my name. That's good. So I will call this meeting of the Plan Commission to order. We will first hear some technical information from our technical facilitator.
All right, welcome to our virtual Plan Commission meeting. We're going to cover a few basic items before beginning. If you lose connection at any point during the meeting, you can reconnect by clicking the link or calling the number in the original email. To members and city staff, members, if you are able, please activate your video and keep it on for the duration of the meeting. Staff, if you are able, please activate your video when you are speaking. The chair, clerk, and technical facilitator are responsible for muting and unmuting committee members. Use the raise hand feature when you'd like to be recognized to speak, ask questions, or request a roll call vote. During any roll call, all panelists will be unmuted briefly. Staff, click raise hand when you are asked a question. The chair will do their best to call on committee members in the order in which their hands are raised. Lowering your hand will take you out of the queue. Members of the public who have registered to speak, the name you entered in Zoom must match the name you entered in registration. You will remain muted until called upon. The clerk will tell you when your time is up. After speaking, a member of the body may ask you a question. If you need to share documentation with the board, please send it to the email list in today's agenda. Chair, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jesse. The first item on the agenda is public comment, and we do have one person registered for public comment. Kurt Steggy, 82 Cambridge Road, Madison, Wisconsin, neither support nor opposed and wishing to speak, representing the Madison Trust for Historic Preservation. Mr. Steggy. Is Mr. Steggy unmuted on our end?
Correct. I believe this is this Kurt?
Yes.
It is. I just hit it the second time.
Okay, very good. You're on.
Okay. I'm a retired attorney. I'm here as president of the Madison Trust for Historic Preservation. Thank you for the opportunity to be present and to speak. I submitted written comments very recently. I'd encourage you to read those. My goal this evening, in a couple minutes, is to add some context regarding the scope of this special meeting, as that scope is reflected in the submissions by staff. Those materials focus on the limited topic of the interaction of zoning provisions with ordinance provisions and city plan documents relating to historic resources in the city. Specifically, those historic resources being referenced are the formally recognized City of Madison local landmarks and the City of Madison local historic districts. This is an important topic, and I'm very glad that the staff has reviewed it. Having said that, the subject of the staff submission is just a small part of how the Plan Commission impacts Madison's culture and character. The character of the city has many contributing factors. Local landmarks and local historic districts are one contributor, but they are only a small part of Madison's formally designated historic assets, which include properties recognized as historic by both the state and at the federal level. Those formally designated historic assets at all three levels of government are also a small subset of old buildings in the city And it is this much larger category of old buildings, both individually and in neighborhoods, that heavily contribute to Madison's character. My written submission gets into why old buildings are so important in establishing city character and desirability. I encourage you to review that. The second aspect of considering a larger context in terms of the impact of the commission on city character is that the focus of the staff is really on building height. However, a building's character, as it contributes to both a neighborhood's character and a city's character, depends on many more characteristics than mere height. Building height is important, and I'm glad we're being addressed. It is being addressed, but so are such other aspects or factors such as volume, bulk, street facade area, number of stories above grade, as well as a building's character depending on the surrounding landscape of that building. It depends on symmetry or asymmetry. It depends on patterns, dormers, chimneys, doors, windows, all kinds of things. And these are only certain limited aspects of what constitutes
I'm sorry to have to interrupt, but that concludes your available time. Thank you, Mr. Steggy. The next registrant is John Martens, 4118 Hague Avenue, neither support nor opposed, wishing to speak. Mr. Martens. And just a reminder, you do only have 3 minutes. Thank you.
I'll go as fast as I can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name is John Martens. I have 49 years experience working as an architect and sometimes developer here in Madison. I also served 11 years on the Madison Zoning Board of Appeals, 6 years as chair. I was responsible for the restoration of the national landmark Madison Candy Company on Williamson Street, and I began the project by salvaging signs, artifacts, and various historic materials. At that point, I was just an impediment in the way of the contractors who were working as fast as they could. They recommended that I just throw away that old stuff and buy new, that using old material would actually cost more and take longer, and they're right. I tried to explain to them how important those things were, but that mostly fell on deaf ears. As the work progressed, I pointed out certain aspects of the building and why they were there. All those patched up holes in the walls had been inlets for chimneys for the stoves that cooked the candy. The old addition at the rear of the building used to house a railroad spur where the sugar was unloaded and candy was sent out to all over the Midwest. Those same railroad tracks were also where the kids used to play when occasionally a hand would emerge from a third floor window and toss them a handful of lemon drops or bonbons. Soon those same contractors began bringing old coins that they found in the walls, candy wrappers that fell out of the ceiling, even the rat-chewed shoes they found in the attic. We sat around at lunchtime talking about how things used to be built and why. And when I was finally installing that nasty old wainscoting in the main corridor, a couple of them actually punched out and asked me if they could help install it. It was almost like Tom Sawyer painting the fence. Everyone just wanted to be a part of it. My point is that these folks were not preservationists. They were not interested in the name of the architect or even the particular style of the building. But when it came to the stories, they were all ears. I have seen this happen many times over. I think that preservation is often considered as something for only an elite few, but I have seen that there is not a single person who doesn't light up when they start to hear those stories. These old buildings are the repositories of those stories, and we're steadily losing them. This is our culture. It belongs to all of us, and given a chance, It resonates deeply with everyone, no matter what their other interests. That's why we need preservation. It's about human nature, an authentic glimpse at where we came from, who we really are, and maybe even to where we are headed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martens. The last registrant is David Molenov, 1501 Morrison Street, Madison, neither support nor opposed, wishing to speak. And a reminder, you do have 3 minutes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Dave Molenhoff. Most of you don't know me, so I do want to provide some quick background. I'm a longtime preservationist who served in the Landmarks Commission for 8 years, owned a contributing building in Mansion Hill for 54 years, and have written 2 books on Madison history. In my 3 minutes, I want to comment on one of the recommendations in the staff report and to suggest a principle for the relationship between zoning and historic preservation. Staff recommendation number 2, map the building heights proposed in the Williamson Street build plan in either the zoning ordinance or the historic preservation ordinance. My response: the Build 2 plan includes detailed standards for building heights, but also for many other qualities that define historic character. Therefore, all of the Build 2 standards, not just height, should be made an amendment to the Third Lake Ridge Historic District Ordinance. I would also call your attention to page 4 of the staff report that strongly suggests that height maps are not designated to handle, quote, subtle height limits, unquote, in historic districts. This language causes me to conclude that our historic districts may be too complex for height maps to be useful. And now the principle. The Landmarks Commission is best qualified to determine matters relating to the management of historic resources. 3 reasons. Because the difficult goal of the Landmarks Ordinance is to preserve the historic character of our resources. Because historic districts are extremely complex and varied enclaves of buildings. And finally, because the preservation of historic character requires the Commission to use a constellation of factors stipulated in the ordinance that go beyond the fixed metrics of the zoning code. In my written remarks, I attest an example of 10 such factors called preservation principles that would effectively preserve historic character in our districts. These principles have been presented to an ad hoc committee of 5 alders that are developing new standards for our historic districts. 2 of your members, Marcia Rummel and Patrick Heck, serve on this committee. I want to close with an important point. All of Madison's 5 historic districts occupy less than 1% of the total city area, but contribute so much beyond their tiny size to the city's charm and desirability. Therefore, in our efforts to densify the city, we should take all reasonable steps to protect these precious tiny areas with wise and far-sighted policies. I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody may have, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Molenov. And we do have one further registrant, Bob Kleba, 704 East Gorham Street, Madison. Not wishing to speak, but available to answer questions. Before we go to questions, I did skip over disclosures and recusals. Do we have any disclosures or recusals from members of the body? Seeing no raised hands, there are no disclosures or recusals. Now, are there any questions of any of the registrants? I see no questions of any of the registrants. I would say that since this is a special meeting, as we did on some of the other ones, if at a later point you find you do have questions, we can go ahead and do that. But we will move on now to staff presentation. And I'm not sure, are you kicking it off, Ms. Stouter?
Sure, I'll just kick it off very, very briefly and then turn it promptly over to others. Thank you for gathering again this evening. As you know, we're really focused this evening on one of the comprehensive plan recommendations to look at making our zoning code, especially zoning code heights, more consistent with our historic preservation plan and ordinance. And so a staff team has taken a very close look at existing plans, of course, the historic preservation ordinance, and tried to find elements within those that would give clear guidance on changes to the downtown height map or to height limitations elsewhere in the city within our local historic districts primarily. I really want to thank Bill Fruling, Heather Bailey, Dan McAuliffe, and Matt Tucker for a lot of time spent digging into this issue, creating some what we hope are very helpful visuals to walk through this complicated issue in our historic districts. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Bill first. And the staff presentation, the slides will follow those that have been on Legistar that hopefully you've had a chance to review in advance. So thanks very much. Take it away, Bill.
Bill, do you want to raise your hand so I can unmute you? There. Okay, you're on.
Thank you. I think I'll share my screen here for the presentation. Good evening, and thank you for holding this work session tonight. Trying to better coordinate our zoning ordinance and our historic preservation ordinance to achieve the desired future and provide clarity to everybody for what is trying to be accomplished in these areas has been on our radar for some time. I think when the Plan Commission was planning their 2020 work sessions, probably a year ago, the expectation was that the Landmarks Ordinance Review Committee, or LORC, that Dave Molenov referenced, expected that they were going to be done with their work, but that work is ongoing, and so some of the discussions tonight might be a little less certain, but I think it'll be productive nonetheless. When the Plan Commission set their schedule for the work sessions for this year, it made specific reference to heights. So that's the reason that's kind of the primary focus of this tonight. But we'll also talk about a number of other things. So what we have tonight for what we hope to accomplish is to, first of all, provide a common understanding of the current zoning and historic definitions and requirements regarding allowable building height. And as you will find out, it is far more complex than you would think it would be on the face of it. But hopefully, primarily Matt Tucker will be able to lay some of that out, so everybody kind of has a common jumping off point. We also plan on providing some information on the heights of existing buildings in the historic districts, provide some information regarding building heights and other recommendations from some adopted plans. You've heard, for example, the Williamson Street Build Plan mentioned already tonight. We want to provide some recommendations and some options that staff sees for for harmonizing the zoning ordinance and the historic district ordinance. And then at the end, help facilitate a discussion about these options. So this is kind of what we set up for an agenda tonight, working with Chair Zellers. So staff will go through this presentation that follows this agenda. And I also want to call your attention to a memo, staff memo that was sent out that mirrors this presentation, not precisely, but they follow along pretty closely. But the memo really includes a lot of the text and more technical details and references that just don't make for good PowerPoint slides. So I would encourage you to use that as a reference to get more detail if you actually want to see the words of the ordinance. So we're going to start out with an introduction. I'll give a brief bit of planning context, or really why we're here tonight. Then we'll get into some zoning background. Matt will talk about some of the definitions, how heights are measured, and all that kind of fun stuff. And then we kind of broke it down into two chunks of the historic district. One has to do with the historic districts that are downtown. And just to be clear, we're only talking about local historic districts in this discussion tonight. And we'll start out talking about Mansion Hill and First Settlement, the two downtown districts. And the reason we are separating those out is because the way height is measured and how it's defined is different in the downtown than outside of the downtown. So as part of that, we'll talk about the downtown height map. We'll go into each of the districts about what the existing building heights are and what allowable building heights are under zoning. And then our preservation planner, Heather Bailey, will talk about some key points from those historic district ordinances that influence height. Then basically we'll run through the same routine for the three districts that are outside of the boundaries of downtown, those being Third Lake Ridge, Marquette Bungalow, and University Heights. We'll touch on some other adopted plan recommendations and considerations, and then we'll finish with discussion about some recommendations that are included in the staff memo and some other options that we have come up with, and whatever else the Plan Commission would like to talk about. So really, to kind of start this off and why we're here tonight, or the planning context, if you can refer to the memo on the very first paragraph called background. I won't read all of these, but these are some examples of some plans that really, starting with the downtown plan, talk about the need to ensure development in Mansion Hill and First Settlement. Our new development is compatible with the historic context and scale and design. I think the most pointed recommendation, most directly relevant recommendation that we're following up on here tonight is the recommendation from the downtown plan to update the zoning code and heights map to better link the code with the city's historic preservation plan and ordinance. And then in our just recently adopted earlier this year historic preservation plan, I think there was also in that process, it came out that not all city plans and ordinances are quite in sync, and can sometimes send mixed messages as to what the city's policy are and what we are trying to accomplish in certain areas. And so we have these plans that kind of point to this need to really try to better coordinate, particularly those two ordinances, and especially when it comes to height and new development. So that's kind of why we're here today, kind of what we have planned that you'll see in the presentation. And with that, I think turn it over to Matt Tucker to give us a lesson in zoning. And Matt, I can just flip through slides when you
Sure.
mention.
Hello, Plan Commission. Happy Wednesday. So I've been asked to talk about the zoning code requirements for measuring height. And I'm going to try and focus the conversation really on what I'm understanding we're talking about, which is really related to those places that are the historic districts. That's probably the most focus of this. So if those of you that are really into zoning and see me jump over things that are definitely height-related matters, I don't necessarily think they might relate to the discussion about the historic districts, so I might kind of jump past those. But I'm going to get started just by also following the memo. So in the memo, we included a number of provisions that I provided to my colleagues to include that are how the zoning code relates to measuring height in principally two distinct areas. One is the area downtown, and the second would be the area outside of the downtown, which is the area generally not, the area downtown is generally bounded by Park Street to Proudfit around to the lake, over to Blair Street. That's the general downtown area where the downtown districts apply. So the zoning code for height in each of the districts has a limit in the number of stories and height. There are definitions for stories. The definitions are on page 3 on the top for story. Just kind of getting into that, a story is a portion of a building other than a basement or mezzanine, including the surface of any floor and the surface of the floor next above it, or if there be no floor above it, then the space between the floor and the ceiling next above it. So if we're looking at the picture that's being displayed today, this stone building, you can see there's 2 stories that have floor to ceiling relationships, and then there's an area above that is, it's an occupied area, it has dormers and a gable, but it is not technically meeting the definition of a story from the way that we measure height, which is back on page 2 of the memo. So what we attempted to do with the height definition, it was probably one of the most challenging things that we tried to do was our code wanted, the goal was to try and recognize the actual height of buildings from the 4 sides, generally 4 sides that a building might be perceived. So it has language in it that recognizes that we look at all the sides of the building to the highest point of the building to average to figure out what the height is of the building. That's how it's measured. It's measured to the overall peak of the building. Once again, this is areas outside of the downtown. We're going to talk about those in a little bit. That measurement in combination with the definition of a story will tell us how many stories and how tall a building is. In some cases, we run into conditions where buildings are built into hillsides or have exposed basements. If they have a basement that is exposed at a level that's more than 50%, that basement will count as a story, which may be favorable or not favorable depending on the grades in the situation with the building and what the zoning allows. Moving on to, let's talk a little bit more about the downtown. The downtown areas have a way of measurement that is specifically defined in sub D, and it talks about the highest point of the building along at the building setback line parallel to a street adjacent to the building. And it also has an exception to allow those types of things that one would use to gain access to the roof area. Like just the minimal necessary access, like a penthouse for an elevator overrun and the exit stair that's required, not a occupiable space up top. That's how height is measured in the downtown area. But there's also a height map, which is coming up later in the presentation. The height map it indicates the number of stories that are allowed in certain areas. In turn, there is a in the general provisions for the downtown districts, this is on page 3 of the memo, there's a design standard that speaks to minimum maximum heights for stories. So what you end up doing is you build your height of your building by building the allowable minimum maximum heights of the stories, and that also works with the number of stories that are allowed within that map. So what you'll end up with ultimately is a situation where something that is a 5-story building, for example, will have floor-to-floor heights that are understood, and so it wouldn't appear like an 8-story building, or it wouldn't have such great variance that there would be a situation like that. You would have an exceedingly very tall building that might only count from a stories perspective as, say, a 5-story building. I think the next best thing to do is to step into the pictures. So what we're looking at here on the first picture, as I described, is a 2-story building with an occupiable roof. It has dormers running to the left and right and a gable forward. Considered a 2-story building. The overall height is equal to or under 35 feet as measured on the 4 sides. Okay, let's look at the next slide. This building is one where the dormers, when there's a special rule in the ordinance that says when a dormer exceeds 50% of the level of the floor beneath it, that level counts as a story. So this has these big shed dormers on the left and right side. There's a gable forward and a gable back. So this is a 3-story building. Next slide. Here they are kind of sitting next to each other. They're not practically looking significantly different, but they are in how they're measured. And then this slide represents that situation I talked about, how you might have an exposed basement. And so in this case, there's a 1-car garage with a living level or something down there behind that stone wall. That is a more than 50% exposed basement. So this building would potentially count as a 3-story. Now it also has dormers in the roof that allow lighter air in, probably not enough. It's not tall enough to be occupiable, but this one would be a 3-story building. And what's interesting about this slide too is it was one of the things we were trying to tackle with exposure of buildings to their neighbors. Like, look at the property to the right of it. That is a 2-story building there, but it's significantly lower than this building in overall height. And one of the issues that we worked extensively with the Plan Commission when we wrote the height definition in the zoning ordinance was to deal with these relationships of what the actual physicality, the bulk of the building was in proximity to the properties around it. That's why this rule exists the way it does. All right, and then let's look at the next slide. Thanks. Okay, there we go. And this is the downtown area. This is just an example of how we pick that high point for measurement for the height of the building. And in this case, what we would look at is the number of stories that are allowed in the downtown district's height map. And then let's just assume this might be a new building or a 50% expansion building. We would look at the floor-to-floor heights in that design section I mentioned that shows up on page 3 to determine the minimum and maximum heights of those floors to check for compliance with the zoning requirements. And that is what I have. If anybody has any questions?
Yeah, I would like to have questions because that gets pretty complicated, I think, pretty quickly. So do any commissioners have questions? Alder Rummel.
It seems so complicated, Matt. Does it make sense? How do other communities measure these things?
Yeah, it is complicated. We looked at, when we did this, when we wrote this section, there were two efforts, I would say, that happened. Outside of the downtown area, that was done first. And we looked at a number of different communities and ordinances. We looked at a number of different ideas. Also, we brought in experts outside of staff. I had, at the time, the chair of the Zoning Board of Appeals, who was an acting architect, come in, who works out of state. She was working across the country, come in and try and help us figure out how to get the height measurement understood. Because, like I said, we were struggling with how the best way to try and measure and understand and really get our arms around how tall a building is from the variety of sides that you review it. Here we sit 8 years out. I don't think we've had any problems. I mean, besides we've done a few modifications to things like dormers. We did some work several years back to modify some of the dormer regulations to clarify them, particularly related to things that we heard from the Landmarks Commission. Other than that, it's a little complicated, but it works pretty darn well. The times where I think it comes up that it is more complicated are not really the subject of tonight. It's when people are manipulating grade. They're trying to raise the elevation of the grade of their house to raise their house up higher and end up with what is ostensibly just a bigger bulk structure. That gets kind of complicated. Or when new houses are built and there's drop-offs, they're built kind of into holes where it drops off, or when they're built into hillsides, and those can be a little bit complicated. We have had, I think, probably a few variance asks in this, and I think that's worked pretty well. By and large, I think we did a good job. The second part of it was the downtown districts, and that came after the downtown plan was adopted. And that kind of needed a unique approach because there's so much topographic change across the downtown and so much exposure because the buildings are so much larger. And so myself and Bill, we worked on that pretty extensively to try and figure out the best approach, which was the result. I don't know if everybody's happy with it, but it's the way that we found that worked the best to try and understand and try and measure these kind of conditions and elevations. And I should also point out, Heather was, before she was in her current role, she was really, really heavily involved in this height measurement too. Heather was kind of like, you were kind of helping to lead the charge on that, Heather, with me. And boy, was that ever a mess. If you can remember I can remember a couple times we walked out of the room due to stress. Because it's complicated and it's a really tricky thing to measure, but we got there.
Can Bill go back to that one slide where the two buildings are both measured side by side, and one is the one before, and one's 2 stories and one's 3 stories? I mean, I guess the answer is because the percentage of dormers. Is there any other? That's the main reason, right? Why they look the same height, but they have different stories.
That's correct. And I think what you don't see on this slide, and maybe it's the picture before this one, I don't know if that catches the angle, but that there it is. So that on the left side where there's a satellite dish up top there, that is a significant amount of bulk from that side. Adding those dormers creates a pretty substantial living level, and it adds a lot of bulk up into the roof area, and in such that it's almost like the gable almost appears more like an architectural element to break up the facade and it looks like a 3-story building, where typically what you're looking at with dormers is dormers pierce roofs to allow light and air potentially in the space. They're not supposed to dominate that roof. And that's why this dormer dominates that roof, but the other dormers kind of don't. And as you walk through your neighborhood, take a look for these things. And I think you'll understand kind of how that sizing makes sense when you see the way these manifest themselves in the community.
And one final, I don't know if it's a comment more. So when we look at the landmarks ordinance, it kind of wants, like in the, say, Third Lake Ridge, it wants you to have this gabled roof. But in some ways you can add enough dormers to almost create a flat roof condition. It says, I mean, maybe that's more a Heather Bailey question, but I don't know if this comes up at all, but that's what kind of strikes me.
Well, when your dormers get big, they turn into shed roofs because it's hard to do gable roof style dormers that are big. If you look at this one, it's a shed, it's flat. And that's the only way you can get one that's got this much space underneath it. Most dormers, and the dormers that are allowed with basically that the 50% rule are driving you towards, are typically going to be more gable style. I mean, you could do them as shed, but you don't gain as much. So some of that, I mean, the design is definitely the work of the Landmarks Commission. We hope to stay out of that in the zoning ordinance.
Thanks.
Commissioner Cantrell.
Yes, in the previous slide, it shows a 5-story building. If you can go back to that building, so is this treated as a 5-story building, or is it treated as a 6-story building because of the slope of the land, and how do you measure this one?
Sure. So once again, you go to that high point, and this one would measure as a 5. I'm guessing. I don't know exactly what's up on the roof of this, or if it's an accessible roof and if it has that ability to get up there. But I believe this is a 5-story building.
Okay.
So the great exposure that you see in big long buildings, there are certain ones that have a bunch of stories that are exposed on the back side or the low side. We look at from the lower side. So they'll have a higher elevation. They'll have more exposure, more stories exposed, but we only look from the higher point, which is
so that example takes me back to the Langdon. From Langdon Street, it was, I don't know, maybe 4 stories or 8, but from the north side of the building, it was like 10 or 11. So you don't really consider the slope side. You just consider the front facade and the height at the front facade.
Yeah, the high point. And at the time that we were, basically you're there, but I would say a good example of this is at the time that we were, or just before we were working on this matter, and the redevelopment or the big addition to the Edgewater Hotel was discussed.
Okay.
And that's a 9-story on the Wisconsin Avenue side, and I think about 15 on the back.
Oh,
it's
okay.
a 9 as measured. Okay. And that was very much part of the conversation for the Plan Commission, for the City Council when we were doing this work.
Okay.
Although, just to seek a little clarification on that, since that wasn't adjacent, paralleling a street adjacent to it, it wasn't defined as a street. So that wasn't then considered really at all as a measurement, as I recall. Is that correct?
You know, I'm not exactly sure. First off, I think that project predated this work we have.
I think Commissioner Cantrell's talking about the recent application that we have. Is that,
I don't know. I'd have to kind of look into that one. Was that the one the redevelopment of that one? The core properties one or whatever? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that has a high point. There is no, it's all one street frontage. It's in the middle of a block property. So,
and even though the back is kind of on a alley almost, it's not a public,
it's an easement
right away street.
Correct. Yeah, it's in the middle of the block. So we would measure right from that front.
But if there was a street behind it, would that make any difference?
We would measure from that highest point. So we would only measure from the lowest front corner, and that's how we've applied this rule. The highest grade.
Okay, but so I guess my question is, if there was a street behind that building, it wouldn't matter. You would just still measure it from the Langdon Street, from the lowest point to the highest point of the building.
From the highest point to the highest point.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry if that was confusing.
No, I got you.
If the easiest way to think of it is like the decision was made to kind of forgive the exposure side. Okay. And kind of measure from the high point.
Okay.
And Matt, just to clarify, that's only for the downtown. Outside of downtown, it's measured differently.
Correct. That the boundaries of that distinct area, and that's because of the sort of there's all those other pieces that are built in to make height be understood. The numbers of stories, the floor to floor part, and that specific definition only applies to. And frankly, what it says is it applies to the districts that are called the DC, UOR, UMX, DR1, and DR2 districts. And those are only downtown districts within that boundary.
Okay.
Use that illustration, please, to then clarify how that would be measured if it were a building outside the downtown.
There's this next slide that might help with that.
Yeah, the last one.
We didn't really get to yet.
Yeah, the last one. Okay. So if it's measured outside the downtown, what happens is we take the sides. Let's just for ease, let's just assume it's a normal 4-sided building. And we would take the 4 measurements and we would average those to figure out what the measurement is. So you might have a situation if you're building into a hillside where one of those is going to be higher than the amount allowed because the average of the 4, meaning the one that's built into the hillside, is going to be less. So you'll have that favorable consideration. There is a specific clause that says in that definition, it says no individual facade shall be more than 15% higher than the maximum height of the district. And that is to understand the building into a slope and building into a drop off. Like you might have a house that's a 1-story, but it has a basement exposure. And when you're measuring it, the backside could have significant exposure. I think the number when we do the 15% is like something like 41.2 or something like that feet would be the absolute maximum for a building that's supposed to be 35 feet tall to take advantage of that 15% exception. I don't know. I think we might have had a project once on Willie Street that touched on this, where it might have been, its front elevation might have been a little higher, but when you looked at the sides and the rear, it averaged to be less than the overall.
I'm glad, this is Brad again. I'm glad that you clarified that because I was reading the height of bulk regulations and that sub B is exactly what you were talking about. And I was thinking, well, how does that apply to the Langdon? And so but anyway, thank you for clarifying that.
Sure.
Do you have any further questions, Commissioner Cantrell?
Not at this time, thank you.
While we're on this height thing and the difference between the downtown and not downtown, given the significant, and we're talking about historic districts, given the significant topographical change in University Heights, it's not clear to me why we would be measuring height differently in these 2 historic districts. Is it just kind of happenstance because we decided to do downtown differently than the rest of the city? Or it seems, I guess, kind of inconsistent to have such significant differences in measurement of heights in these 2 historic districts.
Well, I think you touched on it, and it's just because they're 2 different places. And we have other places that aren't in historic districts that have equally significant height, grade changes in the city. And the rule for outside the downtown applies to those places also. It's just the structure of the ordinance at the time and the way that the city decided to proceed to establish regulations for these 2 areas. The downtown was just handled uniquely. I think there might have been a member or 2 here that was on ZCRAC. Eric Sundquist, I think you were around for the good old days. The ordinance came first for the outside the downtown area, and the last thing that we did, because it was just after the downtown plan got adopted, was then spin that into zoning regulations. And so that we worked with the Plan Commission very closely on how to do that using the downtown plan language to get us where we were for those specific regulations. I can't say they specifically said, let's do it because I had the historic districts. We knew that there were historic districts downtown, but we also knew the downtown was downtown, and we were dealing with a lot of issues with the downtown, across the downtown. The downtown lot, sorry.
And if I could add to that a little context to the downtown plan, I think at the time we did the downtown plan, there were a lot of, it was kind of towards the beginning of a bigger wave of development of bigger buildings than we had really seen prior to that in the downtown, in different areas of downtown. And in the discussions about those, a lot of the focus was on building heights. And people couldn't generally understand building heights when you're talking about feet and inches, but people had a sense of story. What 3 stories look like compared to 6 stories. People generally had a sense of that. And so I think when we were in the planning process of the downtown plan, that's how people talked about it, because it was kind of a more common, easily understood language than talking about feet. And so I think that concept just kind of carried through. And when we were doing the downtown plan, we were trying to look at it really broadly and looking at bigger patterns of building heights, where outside of downtown, the building height is determined by the zoning district that a property has. And so instead of having height being determined by the district, we were trying, we kind of came up with this concept through the process. What if we did like a height overlay map in the downtown? And I'll talk about that in just a minute. And so regardless of whatever any individual property might be zoned, and you could have, a number of different zoned properties in a given block, that what was more important is how tall the buildings were in that block. And so I think that's kind of how that evolved. And like Matt said, the downtown plan and the zoning district were being developed at the same time, kind of on parallel tracks. And so it just kind of translated into the zoning code.
Thank you. Are there any further questions on height by commissioners?
Chair Zellers, could I just add one more piece about where we came from real quick? One of the things that we were coming from too, just to follow up with what Bill was talking about, was the district that there were 2 districts that covered the downtown area that were like that residential type districts. And one of them, the R6 district, had a floor area ratio, which it didn't have a height limit. It just had floor area ratio. So the height of the building was a function of how big your lot was. So you could have a very tall, skinny building that could be very tall, or you could have a lower, wider building that would be just shorter. So there wasn't really clarity in how tall a building could be. There was the R6H district, which applied to, I think, Mansion Hill. I think it covered almost straight up on Mansion Hill. And that had a 50-foot height limit, and that was even measured differently. So, we had a real mess for how we were measuring height in the downtown area.
Thank you. Any questions by commissioners? If not, then we will move on to the rest of the presentation.
I think Heather Bailey was going to spend about 1 minute on this slide, if she could be unmuted, and then I'll follow her again.
There, she raised her hand. Okay, Heather.
Okay, so just quickly, we have 5 local historic districts, and those are then regulated by the Historic Preservation Ordinance. You'll see that 4 of those are out on the isthmus, and we have 1 outlier, University Heights, out further west. And these span from Mansion Hill being the first historic district, we'll get into more detail with that, up to First Settlement being the most recent adopted local historic district. But here's the grouping of properties that we were talking about in terms of our local historic districts. That's all I wanted to say about that. We'll get into more detail with each of them as we progress further.
Thanks, Heather. And that will be in about 2 seconds, I think.
Right.
So there's already been the downtown heights map, and the downtown plan and zoning has already gotten a little playtime tonight. So So here is the maximum building heights map from the downtown plan. So you can see that it is focused more broadly on height, I would say, patterns, and tied less to individual zoning districts. This height map was put together in the plan and kind of at the plan and policy level, taking into a number of considerations. The C's, the dark browns, generally closest to the Capitol. That means Capitol view height limit. But you can see that that Mansion Hill, I think you can see my cursor maybe?
Yes.
Kind of in this area is generally 5 stories. I should do more of that. And then First Settlement, kind of over here in the lower right-hand corner, is generally 3 stories with a ring of 6, generally. And so this is the map that ended up getting translated into this map. So this is the map from the zoning code. So while the previous map kind of set the policy and the direction, this map is regulatory. So when we were talking before about heights of properties within the downtown plan being regulated by the downtown height map, it wasn't really the last one. The last one is what informed this one. But this is a map that's just cut and pasted right out of the zoning code. And this is what regulates maximum building heights in the downtown, with some of the caveats that I think Matt was describing before. So that's the relationship between the building heights map and the downtown. And I don't know if you have any questions on that before we move on.
Any questions in regard to the building height maps? Seeing none. Okay, I think, Heather, you're probably back up. Oh, wait. We do now have some questions. Commissioner Cantrell.
Yeah, my question is, so any building within the Mansion Hill area, no matter what the zoning district says on height, 5 stories is allowable? It may be a conditional use or whatever, but 5 stories is allowable.
It's allowable by zoning, but as we're going to talk about in about 3 slides or maybe 2 slides, then you have to layer in the historic district requirements. So, so may not be able to be 5 stories in all instances. And I think it's important to keep in mind the title of this map is the maximum building height map.
Okay.
Good question though.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to add, for the benefit of some commissioners, that our downtown zoning districts are uniquely applied within this downtown area that's shown here. So the menu of downtown zoning districts differs from the menu of zoning districts utilized elsewhere throughout the city. And within the downtown districts, the only height limitations really are on this map. So within the districts themselves, there's not a separate height requirement.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather.
Okay, and Alder Rummel.
So I always think about future as opposed to, we have 5 historic districts, but the future could hold more. And I've been sort of mulling over this notion of like that whole corner around the South Hamilton area that's now having that whole area. It just seems like it should be a historic district in my view. And I don't know how to even go about saying that, but obviously this map gives permission to people to say, oh, let's tear down all that historic old stuff. And I'm wondering how we're going to balance those kind of the signals that we give with this height map to what is some of our older buildings that might be worth saving.
Ms. Bailey, did you want to take that, or Mr. Fruling?
I think that's a great point, and that's something that was discussed through the process of the downtown plan. So I know some of you were around for that. What turned into be a 4-year long process, and so this specific quadrant that you're talking about was discussed in that. In which direction we should go with that. And I guess the ultimate decision was there's probably it's probably more of a redevelopment site than overall in that 10-story area and the Capitol View area next to it than a historic district. And we haven't had any any requests come forward to look at that as a historic district. Some of those buildings in there are certainly older, and yeah, I guess that's just where the plan came out.
Did you have anything further, Alder Rummel?
No, thank you.
Any other questions before we move on? Okay, Ms. Bailey.
Okay, so Mansion Hill, to give you a little bit background of this local historic district. I know you recently have had discussions about a proposal for a property in one of our National Register districts. National Register is an honorary designation that comes with financial incentives to assist property owners in ongoing use and rehabilitation of their properties. Local historic district comes with property protections. So it ensures the preservation of these resources, and the language in our historic district ordinance is looking at our historic resources as being a shared asset for the city. This is part of our shared heritage. So the first of the historic districts that was created was Mansion Hill. It was created in 1976. It is one of the early prestigious neighborhoods downtown. The other one is largely no longer extant. It features distinctive architecture and was home to many of Madison's early leaders. It comprises parts of the Mansion Hill National Register District, some of the Langdon National Register District, and a couple of other properties that aren't even in either of those. So it covers a larger area than those honorary designations. This is what we had decided was what we were calling our local Mansion Hill Historic District. So that's my context for Mansion Hill. With the first round of historic districts, as part of the process for creating a historic district, the historic districts are supposed to have a preservation plan that provided some additional guidance and how we were going to move forward with actually preserving these resources. So the Mansion Hill preservation plan included some guidelines and language, but then had some visuals to go with it, because this is the first time we were going to be dealing with these types of tools. So with these drawings, we're looking at height, and you'll see in the attached memo, I also pulled out the parts of each of the historic district standards that address items that fall into the realm of height and the feeling of how big these buildings are. And so one of those things is the gross volume. So earlier, Matt Tucker was talking about when we used to have FAR as a way that we did things where you could have a short, wide building or a tall, skinny building. Gross volume affects the character and the feel of the mass of this building. But also the proportion of doors and windows has to deal with, how many holes are we putting in these buildings? What are the size of these? And these are the types of things that we're looking at with the design of a new structure. And most of the standards for Mansion Hill are talking about new development and not necessarily addressing the preservation of the existing resources. That is way those particular standards are constructed at the moment. Turning it over to the next.
Yeah, I think that Dan McAuliffe, if you could unmute Dan. Dan, you might want to raise your hand if you haven't already, is going to...
It's on. Okay, go ahead, Dan.
All right. So I'm going to briefly go through just some of the data about year built and the kind of period of significance, as well as the existing and allowable heights in some of those historic statistics. So within Mansion Hill, period of significance is approximately up to 1930. That's actually consistent across almost all of our historic districts, which is why it's going to be symbolized consistently through there. It might deviate a year or two. And this is all coming from our assessor's data. We've corrected it where we've received some information, but it does get kind of complicated, particularly when buildings are condoed, because some parts will have different years, some data will be missing. So it is kind of challenging. So as you can kind of see, most of it, a fair amount of it is in the period of significance, particularly between 1930 and probably about 1880. A lot of the newer stuff is along the lake. Next slide, please. And as we mentioned, the downtown height for this area is about 5, generally in the 2 to 3 stories. And as we kind of discussed with some of those zoning slides, particularly the 2 and the 3, or the 1 and the 2 can really have dramatically different visual impacts based on the percentage of exposed basements, the amount of dormers. These also relatively taller stories that we saw as well. And again, some of those kind of what we saw is historic homes or older homes generally in the 2 to 3 stories, mansions sometimes in the 3 to 4, and period and then non-period apartment buildings in the 5+. Next slide, please. Oh, this is back to Heather.
Okay. So First Settlement is our most recently designated historic district. It was designated in 2002. This area represents the first American settlement of Madison. And so this was an area that is largely characterized by simple houses. These are this was one of the first neighborhoods of downtown Madison. The period of significance for the first settlement, the historic district, is 1850, and currently it says to 1920. I think that as part of us adding the periods of significance in LORC 1, which helps to define what properties are we talking about as being the historic resources that help characterize this particular district. We put 1920 in our language, but then several of the standards talk about how certain elements need to replicate the look of pre-1930 buildings. So I think it was supposed to be 1930 as part of our historic district updates that we are undertaking. My recommendation is that we modify the period of significance to be 1850 to 1930, and that would then encompass the historic resources that are there and align with the original language and I think intent of the historic district ordinance for First Settlement.
All right. And again, so when we look at the period of significance, a lot of the this one has a lot more buildings outside the period of significance, a lot of the newer townhomes, some of the office buildings as well along the periphery. But there is some, particularly on a couple of those smaller streets that do have clusters within that period of significance. Next slide. Again, still within the downtown plan, this area is a mix of 3 stories within kind of the center of the neighborhood and 6 on its periphery. And again, measured through the downtown zoning map. One thing that I also forgot to mention previously, so we took the zone or the assessor's data as the base for heights, and then we kind of did a Google Street View tour and used basically what we could see from the streets to determine what the zoning height would be. We look at the street, what the basement level, as well as kind of the dormers. So we may not get 100% accuracy with those mathematical precisions about what is 50% exposed and not, and what is a 50% dormer. But we did our best shot with a visual assessment. Next slide.
So up next, Heather and Dan will do the same thing they did for Mansion Hill and First Settlement for the other 3 historic districts that are outside of downtown. But I just wanted to, ask the commission if they should just go ahead and run through those, or if you want to take a pause and ask questions of the first.
Okay, we do have a question, Commissioner Cantrell.
Yes, could you go back to Mansion Hill? I guess I thought the height map was really interesting, and I guess I was part of the planning process for the downtown plan back, I don't know, 8-9 years ago or more. How did we or staff come up with 5 stories in some of this area where it appears that maybe a 3-story may have been a better designation for at least part of that area, since the majority of the buildings would fit within that size or of height better than 5 stories. But so could staff talk about that? I guess I don't remember even kind of getting a fine grain analysis of like this map at that point in time.
I can talk about it a little bit. My memory's a little fuzzy on that too, because that was quite a while ago. But we did a pretty detailed heights analysis on, actually a very detailed height analysis on all of the downtown. I guess kind of from what I can recall from that is this has been the 5-story height limit had been in place generally for quite some time. I think the buildings in Mansion Hill are larger buildings. I mean, they're mansions. So they're just have a bigger footprint. They generally have taller floor-to-floor heights. They have more prominent roofs. A lot of times they have, architectural features that add to the mass of the building, such as cupolas and things like that. And I think generally it was the feeling that even though by definitions of stories, if they're like 2 stories or 3 stories, that they can generally more easily coexist with 5-story more modern buildings, and that's about what I remember of that.
Was part of that analysis based on kind of what the existing zoning was, so that it would not be so dramatically different than what, and again, I don't know what First Settlement was zoned back then, but was that part of the thought process?
Yeah, I don't know, there wasn't a strict formula to how much weight was given to different factors, but that was one of one of the factors. We weren't trying to transform areas, particularly areas that are designated historic districts, into something different than what they are. So that probably carried a little more weight in this area.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any other questions before we move away from the downtown? If you just go back to that map, I will just make one observation that the 4 and greater story buildings, and actually most of the 3 and greater story buildings, were built outside of the period of significance. So while we're on this map, if you compare back and forth, that is something in terms of dates that the maps show. Okay, I think you're up again, Heather.
Okay, so Third Lake Ridge is a sizable historic district. It was designated in 1979. It contains 3 National Register districts. Although the majority of the properties within Third Lake Ridge are not within a National Register district. So in the northwest corner there, we have the East Wilson National Register District. Then you come on down to where Jennifer and Spate split out there, and that is the Jennifer Spate National Register District. Then you get on over to Orton Park and the properties around it that frame it. That is a district, but then the vast majority of this district is just a local historic district. There are only a couple of areas that are properties that have the National Register designation. As a large area, it represents diverse history and diverse building types. This presents a different element of history to some of our other historic districts, in that this district helps to speak to the working class and middle class people, and again, diversity of people who lived in Madison back in the day. The period of significance for Third Lake Ridge is 1850 to 1929.
All right. And so Third Lake Ridge, a little more diverse in terms of its year of construction, particularly along the Willie Street corridor. As you transition more into the neighborhood, the dates get a little more stable and do kind of focus in, again, on that period of significance. You notice a lot of gaps in here as well for year built. That's, again, because we are pulling from the assessor's data primarily. If a property is not on the tax rolls, for example, churches, anything owned by a nonprofit, there's no commercial record for those, so we don't have that data in our immediate data set. Next slide. When we look at our height, again, actually relatively consistent throughout kind of the neighborhood, generally 2 to 3 stories, with the exception of kind of the tip of Willie Street, a couple higher stories up to the 5 and even into the 6 in a couple areas. You'll notice that one building on the lake, a lot of stories. Again, that's kind of really illustrating kind of the difference in how we measure height in the downtown versus other areas. If we measured this one as we would in the downtown, it would be 3 stories because that building kind of tails off to the lake, and we can only have 1 basement. We measure that facade. It's significantly higher. So that one shows up, even though the visual difference at the street is basically the same as the surrounding neighborhoods. Next slide. And the allowable heights. So we're transitioning now out of the downtown height map. We are now using heights by the base zoning districts. Some of these districts do have, and we did focus exclusively on what is the permitted use. Some of the districts have multiple permitted uses and they have different allowable heights. So for example, I believe I think it's TRV4. That might be a guess. I don't know exactly what the zoning district is for most areas. It'll allow single families at 2 stories and 35 feet. When you transition to, let's say, townhomes or a fourplex, which is a permitted use in those districts, you're allowed 3 stories and 40 feet. So we took that maximum allowable height in those. So as you can see, it's a mix of 3 as well as 2 stories. As well as 5 kind of at that tip. Next slide.
I should mention, because Third Lake Ridge is so long, we split it up into an east and west. So even though we're going to talk about Marquette bungalows for a second, we will catch up on the east side of Third Lake Ridge coming up there too. Yeah,
I think we squinted our computers enough as it is, so I figured I'd try to make it a little bit bigger.
Okay, so Marquette bungalows is that all of our historic districts are unique. This one's unique. So Marquette Bungalows was designated in 1993. It is also a National Register district, and it is our one local historic district that is coterminous with a National Register district. The NR district is the same as the local historic district. It also has a very tight period of significance, 1924 to 1930, because all of these except for the property down in the bottom left-hand corner, which predated the redevelopment of these two blocks, are part of a wave of development, and they're all bungalows. So they're all of a very similar height. They're all of a very similar style. These were all developed as part of an overall development for these two blocks. You see that fun shape there in the middle of the rounded lots, and that's because the streetcar used to come through there, and so it needed a little bit of a wider right-of-way to weave its way on through. These, when you drive through this neighborhood, you know that you're in the bungalows district, because they are all bungalows, again, with the one exception. That's what I have to say about the bungalows.
All right. Well, I'll just follow that one up and talk. Actually, the height one's next. So again, a little more variability, particularly along the lakefront, where we often see new construction, as well as on through the Willie Street corridor. Again, generally period of significance before 1930. Next slide. Kind of keeping on that Marquette Bungalows, most of those from a zoning definition are actually one story, because they are, it's a pitched roof with a dormer that's less than half of the width of that. Generally, sorry. It's all right. But other than that, very consistent height, 1 to 2, primarily a couple 3-story buildings, predominantly on the Willie Street corridor. And allowable, again, very consistent. 2 to some 3s on the Willie Street corridor, relatively low height.
Okay, so University Heights, our one that's off the isthmus. This was one of Madison's first suburbs. It was home to many of the university professors and university employees, and it has so that encompasses the history of this particular district, is its connection to the university and the people who work there. But it is also a very fascinating collection of distinctive architectural styles. There are several buildings that were designed by the big name architects. If you want a tour of a collection of a span of distinctive architectural styles, this is the district to go through. For what is included in this local district, it includes all of the University Heights National Register districts. The bottom edge there on our map is part of the West Lawn National Register district, and there are some additional properties that are just part of our local district that aren't a part of any National Register district. The period of significance for University Heights is 1893 to 1928.
All right, and again, for graphical purposes, that's rounded to 1930, just to keep everything consistent. Again, very, very, as you see, most of those buildings are between 1900 and 1930, with a couple of older buildings spattered in, as well as a couple new ones. Next slide. Height-wise, really, really consistent, right around to a couple 3s and just a couple 4-story buildings. So those are predominantly on the University Avenue corridor on Breeze Terrace, as well as the elementary school right there in Region. Next slide. Allowable per zoning, again, relatively low heights. We have 2 exclusively throughout, with the exception of the University Avenue corridor. Down on Breeze Terrace, again, right across from Camp Randall, as well as the kind of block in. Those are predominantly student rentals in that vicinity, and just a couple 3 stories at the corner of Regents, as well as up at the tip by the Southwest Path.
How
those.
Okay, before we move on to other plans, are there any questions by commissioners about the University Heights or Third Lake Ridge or Marquette Bungalows? I see no questions, so let's move on to other plan considerations.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned at the outset, there are the regulatory aspects of building heights in our historic districts, in the zoning code and in the historic preservation code, but as the Plan Commission, you're well aware that we have a number of adopted plans, and many of those plans have recommendations regarding a number of things, including building heights. We've talked about the downtown plan quite a bit. The University Avenue Corridor Plan touches a portion of the University Heights Historic District. You've heard a number of references tonight to the Williamson Street, actually technically the design guidelines and criteria for preservation for Williamson Street, and the Lamp House Block Plan. So the Lamp House Block Plan is not technically, doesn't overlap any historic districts, but we thought that it was appropriate to bring it up here. So, some of the excerpts related to these plans and the topic we're talking about tonight are included in the memo. I don't know that I need to go through those, but I wanted to, as kind of a segue into getting into the discussion about recommendations and other options, just kind of say that the recommendations that we included in the memo are kind of directives from recommendations in these adopted plans, or the related to the adopting resolutions for each of these documents. So I don't know if you have questions about these plans now. I want to get it right into the recommendations and discussions about that and options, and we can refer back to these if you want.
I see no raised hands, so let's continue.
All right, let's continue. So, taking right from the memo, the first recommendation that we had to do with the Lamp House Plan. So the Lamp House Plan, which was adopted in 2014, really focused on the context surrounding the Frank Lloyd Wright designed local landmark called the Lamp House. That, as you can see, I would think many of you are familiar with this, but it's kind of one of those hidden gems, so you may not be that familiar with it. But the Lamp House is sitting in the middle of this block between North Webster and Butler, East Washington Avenue and East Mifflin Street. And much of the significance of this particular property was that Frank Lloyd Wright built this for his friend, Mr. Lamp, and he could be up on the roof of his building and look out over the lake and see sailboats. So there was a committee that put this plan together. It was adopted by the Common Council, and kind of a primary recommendation of that plan was the views from the house out towards the lake was such a prominent factor in the design of this house that historic context was important to maintain. So that plan made some very specific recommendations about changing the downtown height map. Again, this was adopted by the council. And so what you see on the left-hand page here is just an excerpt or a cutout from the current downtown maximum building heights map in the zoning code. The map on the right is what was included in the plan, and recommended that the map on the left be changed to reflect the map on the right. And so, so that's recommendation number one. One of the things that, as we were looking at this and thinking about this recommendation more carefully in preparation for this meeting, is there is some more detailed data that was not available to us at the time. The Lamp House plan was done, and that has to do with some new digital elevations that are accurate to within 1 foot. So it's probably worth taking a look at, because what we were working off before was just the stories. And because of the topography and the way, it kind of the hill falls away from this and then it rises again, before the lake, that if the Plan Commission would like us to take a little bit more precise look at how we map those building heights, from this map, just in stories, we could probably refine it a little bit more by portions of blocks. We could take a look at that because we have new data available to us that was not available when the Lamp House plan was done. Our second recommendation here had to do with the Williamson Street build plan, or the Willie Street build plan. As described in the memo, this plan was adopted in 2004. One of the recommendations of that plan was to take the recommendations in this Willie Street build plan, and as has been previously stated, there are more recommendations having to do with the physical design, particularly of new construction, other than just building heights. But the adopting resolution for this plan, directed staff to incorporate these recommendations into the Third Lake Ridge Historic District criteria. That wasn't done, but we think this is a good opportunity that maybe we want to adopt the concept of having a maximum building height map overlay in the zoning code to this area. So something that's currently not available or not done outside of the downtown area may be appropriate to do in this case. And that is one of our recommendations. Recommendation 3 had to do with mapping setbacks and step backs along streets in the Mansion Hill district. That was one of the recommendations of the downtown plan, something that could be explored in this area. There's this provision to map these in the zoning code. And just by way of example, we did this, maybe it was like 2 years ago in the Langdon Street corridor. And we would propose to follow a similar process in Mansion Hill. And that process was really to look at block face by block face, gather some data about existing building setbacks from the street, and propose some ranges, have a public process to help narrow that down, and then come up with a recommendation that would be, that we would forward to the Plan Commission and Common Council. In this case, the Common Council adopted this, and so there is a mapped building setback along Langdon Street now that is part of the zoning ordinance. And one of the things that I think we have talked about with staff is even though it's not directly related to building height, that's already a recommendation in an adopted plan that's gone through a public process. And setting a consistent line along the street, can really help with the consistency and feel of an area. And so that's our third recommendation. Oh, sorry, here is so this map was kind of the working maps that we had through the public process to facilitate discussion. And this is the result that's actually in the zoning code. We've talked about Mansion Hill some, and I expect we will talk more about it here. But here's an example of this probably should have been actually in an earlier slide, but a 2-story building next to a 5-story building, and there's a line that you can't really see there about where that 5-story or 6-story building is measured. Oh, I should stop after this recommendation. So we had those 3 specific recommendations. Then we also had a 4th recommendation that of just getting rid of the height definition in the historic preservation ordinance and just let the definition of building height in the zoning code be what rules in that regard. We could repeat it, I guess, in the historic district ordinance, but having different definitions of building height in the different ordinances, I think it just kind of unnecessarily adds to some of the confusion. And so,
Bill, I think you missed the first settlement recommendation. Did you intend to?
Oh, no, that's coming up here.
Oh, okay.
So first we had our recommendations. So we had the 3 we went through, and the 4th was the one about deleting the height definition from the historic preservation ordinance. And then we had some options. So those are our recommendations. And just to facilitate discussion, there were a couple other things that we discussed. In the first settlement area, if you can see it on here, kind of designated by the red lines, most of the kind of the core of the district, maximum building height by the height map is 3 stories along Wilson Street, and kind of wrapping the corner here along Blair, it's 6 stories. So that just seemed like a little bit of an abrupt transition, perhaps. And so we looked at an example that we used in the Capitol Gateway corridor, where in some areas there's more of a slope down or a transition. So after you go up 3 stories, then the upper stories have to be on a 30-degree angle. So in the first settlement district, one of the things that we talked about that we just wanted to raise for the Plan Commission is that could, around this edge where the 3-story butts up against the 6-story, that might make for a little bit better transition there.
Okay, thank you very much. I think unless one of the Plan Commissioners has a different suggestion, what I would like to do is go through the recommendations then that staff have made, including the first settlement idea, to be followed by the memo that I did send to Plan Commissioners. But let's take a look at the lamp house first. So could you
like me to stop sharing?
No. Well, we may need to see that Yeah. I think that would be helpful to see that. So I'd like to hear what commissioners think about this recommendation to formally change the zoning height for the Lamp House view shed. Ms. Solheim.
Just a quick question. The proposed map on the right indicates, I see obviously the difference between the 8-story and then partially a 3-story recommendation, but there's also the asterisks by the 4 on the right, even though it's 4 on both sides. What is the differing, what's the recommended change, I guess, to the one on the right?
Mr. Fruehling? Sure.
In the memo on page 9, it describes that, but the 3 the asterisk with the 3 means that it should be limited to maximum height of 3 stories, but not to exceed the height in feet of the peak of the existing structures. And then the 4 with the double asterisk, that any proposals for buildings above 4 stories need to be studied for their impact on lake views from the house. And I think the reason that is in there is because there are provisions in the zoning ordinance through the conditional use process, and I guess through the plan development process, to exceed the heights that are on the map. And so this was to put in place, if you're 4 stories, 3 or 4 stories should be fine. But if you have a proposal to exceed that, then you need to have a view corridor study as part of your submittal materials. That will be one of the things that will be considered.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. That makes sense. That's all I have.
And so, Bill, that would be part of the zoning code then, or where would that caveat live?
Yeah, I think it would be part of the zoning code.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions in regard to Alder Hack?
Thank you. I was just wondering about the parking garage and if, what the city's longer term plans are with regard to the parking garage and how this may or may not impact those. I think I know, but I thought it would be good to have it brought out.
Mr. Fruehling or Ms. Stouter?
Heather,
I guess I could just say that, this is a couple garages down the line. It wouldn't be the next that the city would be able to tackle. It still has plenty of useful life. That said, yes, this would absolutely change the prospects for that site. And so that's an important consideration when we think about what we might want to see on that site in the future. But the fact that the city controls that site, obviously we would honor consistency with our adopted plans and zoning.
Right. I know in the past there have been some concepts floated for housing above a rebuilt garage sometime in the future and things like that. So any such proposal that might come forward in the future would have to follow these changes. Okay, thanks. I get it.
Any other questions or comments? Mr. McAuliffe, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just the only other consideration might be for this site is the topography on Butler slopes down very significantly from that corner. And so what would be able to be constructed at 3 stories on the Mifflin Street facade, if that building line was just extended down, I think that's Butler there, that would be much higher than 3 stories. And again, using the downtown zoning definitions, that wouldn't be a problem unless, however, for some reason through the redevelopment's reconstruction process, there was a platting or something like that. That would force those properties further down on Butler to be consistent with that 3-story, if that was the case.
I would like to get a sense from commissioners as to whether we want to go ahead and pursue these changes. Alder Rummel.
Thank you, Chair. So would we do any kind of process to do outreach and engagement? I mean, I like the idea of it, but I'm sure somebody is going to have something to say about it. So
there was a lot of engagement doing the Lamp House block plan, and it was in that plan, which was adopted, that this recommendation occurred.
Well, I understand that, but since that engagement happened, we've just went through the 400 block of East Washington. And I think there's a lot of neighbors that are kind of worried that this area is under assault. So I would just want to make sure that we do some careful conversations to talk about what the goals are and how this could help protect not only the view shed for this one building, but also kind of protect the historic character of this neighborhood. So I'm generally in support of moving forward with this, assuming we do, more than the minimum engagement. I don't know what that means anymore. We always talk about how important it is, but it's important.
Any other thoughts about this? Alder Hack.
Thank you. Like Alder Rummel, I like this concept, and I agree that some form of reaching out to people would be important for most any of these changes. Probably, I don't know. We'll have to see as we continue the discussion. The Lamp House report was what did we say? 2017. 14. Okay. So, and given that this neighborhood is a little bit on the transient side, I think it would be good to do some outreach to let people know it and understand the purpose of what's going on. Thanks.
Commissioner Cantrell.
I guess in looking at the properties that are impacted, obviously the city garage is, but that's a city-owned property, so that's it's city-owned. The other properties just north of that are pretty significantly impacted, which goes from 8 stories to 4, and also the properties just directly east of the Lamp House. So obviously we would have to have all those property owners would have to be engaged or at least contacted, because it seems like that they're the ones that are impacted the most. The properties in the 4-story are somewhat impacted, but not as impacted as the ones I just outlined. So I guess I'm somewhat concerned. I think that we should narrowly focus this as narrowly as possible if we do it. And I know it's recommended in the plan. I remember the plan and being on the Plan Commission at that time. But anyway, I think that we need to be careful about getting the individuals impacted involved with this as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any other thoughts? Okay, my sense is, and then I'm going to ask if there are, if I don't represent this correctly, that in general there is support for going in this direction, but that it will be important to make sure that the property owners of impacted properties are notified and engaged in some manner. And I'm looking for any raised hands to say anything different. Alder Rummel.
I would just clarify that it's property owners and residents, because they're not always.
Thank you. Property owners and residents. Okay, so then let's move on to the next recommendation, which is Willie Street Build 2 and mapping the allowable heights there. Are there comments in regard to that? Ms. Commissioner Solheim.
I had a quick question on this, and I know that I raised the same question, and I'm still a little foggy on it, for I think it was the 817 Willie Street building. So this would essentially kind of adopt some of these height limits, including that large area that's 2.5 stories. And since we just had that side by side of what's 2 stories and what's 3 stories with a large dormer, I'm trying to wrap my head around what is now 2.5 stories. If you could clarify that a little bit, that would be great.
Mr. Fruehling?
So, I'm sorry, so the question is, what is 2.5 stories?
Yeah, I mean, Matt Tucker went through a detailed discussion of 2 versus 3 stories with those side-by-side examples. So I'm just trying to figure out what is 2.5.
I don't have a plan in front of me, but I'm thinking that a 2.5 story building is by zoning, probably 2 with some dormers, but not the really large dormers. I think that's pretty typical to refer to a 2-story building with a pitched roof, but really no dormers, or maybe really built for occupiable space in that area under roof as a 2-story building. But once you have dormers and start popping it out, it looks more like a 2. So
thank you, Mr. Fruehling. I think Mr. Tucker.
Yeah, thanks.
Can clarify for us?
Yeah, so the half story is a term that shows up in plans periodically, but it doesn't exist in the zoning ordinance, and it hasn't existed in the zoning ordinance in my time. It wasn't in the 1966 ordinance, but generally it relates to that area that is under roof but above a like a floor to ceiling type of an area. In the zoning we would refer to that as there's an occupiable level in that area as a 2. We don't do half stories. So getting rid of the half story would clarify that bit of confusion.
So if we went on the recommendation route of mapping these in the zoning ordinance, it would translate that area from 2.5 to 2, likely.
Yeah, it would be 2, and it would probably recognize that you have usable and occupiable opportunities between the floor and the roof when the roof lines come down, using dormers and gable ends for occupiable space in the level above a second level. It's allowable.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Solheim. Alder Rummel.
Thank you. So I have several series of things to talk about. First, I would just want to point out there's a build 1 And I would think that what affects this part of the historic district affects the other end, and that we should look at extending this concept down Willie Street, and that take a look at what the Build 1 says and compare it to the Build 2, that kind of thing. And to me, that would be really important, because then it's just like this fake line just because of a planning process that isn't really how the neighborhood feels. The second point I would make is, in the table it includes bonus stories. Can we overall look at how we just assign bonus stories? Because one of the criteria here is for structured parking, and nobody's building at grade parking and only building half on a lot and putting parking for the rest. So I don't know why they get an extra story for having to build something they would need anyway, but it's harder to get, say, affordable housing or something else. So, or maybe even some kind of elements about sustainability. So, I mean, to me, the question is like, why do we just wholesale take every element of something that, was a product of a moment in time? Or do we look again more deeply at that? The third thing is the 7-story areas. It's kind of weird, like that little corner on the 600 block. I think part of it's because of Capitol View sheds, but like the zone 1A. I don't know what the parcel looks like, but it looks like it's dividing up an existing parcel. So I guess then you step it back from 3 stories to 7. I just don't really get that. So that little corner to me needs a little bit more work. And I think those are my general points.
Could we get some clarification on what Build 2 covers versus Build 1? I know I don't know, and I'm wondering if other commissioners do. So we're looking only at Build 2 here. Did Build 2 cover up Build 1, or are they 2 different areas, or what?
Build 1 goes down to Baldwin Street and kind of surrounds that intersection.
Okay, so this Build 2 then is its discrete area.
Yes.
And both of them were adopted.
I can't speak flippantly about Build 1 to the same degree as I know about Build 2, but I believe it was an adopted process and plan. Mm-hmm. I'm less aware of if it had specific recs, but we should take a look at it.
So you are saying, Alder Rummel, that you essentially agree with this approach on the Build 2 and this portion of Third Lake Ridge, with wanting a little bit more maybe nuance or clarity or analysis on the point over there to the west of Zone 4.
Right.
Is that accurate, that you're basically supportive of this?
Yeah, I do have questions about the other Zone 1A, but they're not well formed in my brain, because that's like the Elks Club building, and everyone's going to say, what a great site for development, or maybe that'll never go away. Those kind of questions are still, again, when we set these heights, we're sending messages to developers about how much to pay for land and what things are worth. So I want us to be very conscious about telling people how tall things can go in a historic district.
Mr. Fruling, just to make sure that we understand this, what you're showing on this map is what is in Build 2. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so it's implementing an adopted plan.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Did you have any other questions or comments, Alder Rummel?
Well, I think we've heard from I don't know if it was today or yesterday. I've been kind of in the historic preservation mode with Lork, but that the build talks about more than just height. And I know this was framed as a response to a work plan for the Plan Commission about height. but the bill does also talk about setbacks and step backs. So, I would want to make sure we considered how to include those elements.
Commissioner Cantrell.
Yeah, my question is along, I would think that the green section, it doesn't look like you follow a lot line. It looks like the green boundary like encroaches into properties along Williamson Street. So I guess what's up with that? Are you trying to follow lot lines, or doesn't it make any difference? Or so that's my question.
I think this is the best approximation of the plan recommendations in that build too, which doesn't necessarily follow lot lines either.
Okay. Is it important to follow lot lines?
Well, I think in this case, like in the area that Alder Rummel mentioned, that looks a little bit awkward where the red caboose site is, where there's the red zone 4 and the little triangle zone 1A in front of it, the blue triangle. In my mind, I mean, this is one way of doing the step backs.
Yeah.
It's saying, this front portion of the site is going to be X stories, whereas the back portion of it can be Y. I think that's okay. I think that was the intent in the Build 2 plan, and that's just what we're showing here.
Okay, I understand your point. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Alder Rummel.
Yeah, just a small addition. I think I'm remembering, and I haven't read all the details of the plan, but there was this idea of a mid-block alley that you might be seeing represented where, the blue line kind of shifts and turns green. That might have been like, we want to have a mid-block alley and to open up those blocks. But, it just bubbled up. That's all.
Okay, thank you. Alder Heck.
Thank you. Alder Rummel brought up the setbacks that are part of Build 2, and then I guess even a later recommendation we're going to discuss is also about setbacks, and I'm not opposed to talking about those. If this is mostly about height is what brought this conversation forward today. But regardless of that, whether we deal with that or not, there was public comment mentioning that disconnecting height from and setbacks perhaps from essentially the other aspects of something like the Build 2 plan, creates a disconnect in terms of, I think, preservation planning in general, I guess, and protecting resources was what public comment had to say. So I wondered if staff might have an idea of why that is or shouldn't be a problem.
So you're asking about adding the setbacks and whether
I'm asking about, taking aspects of, for instance, the build plan and putting it into zoning code and leaving the rest of it, either setbacks and everything else that's in the Build 2 plan elsewhere. And how do we make sure those things stay connected as people visualize how to do historic preservation? Is that a problem to disconnect them? Especially if you either setbacks or height or both.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Fruling?
Yeah, I can let Matt talk about that, but there was an important point of context that I left out kind of at the beginning of the meeting that I wanted to mention, and that is all of our local historic districts were created prior to our new zoning code. And our previous zoning district was kind of the 60s era, very suburban model that, that cities all across the country had at that time. And when you applied those suburban standards to existing developed areas, especially, some of these small lot and like historic districts, it just didn't fit very well with the way that it was developed. And so I think, now our current district is both much more tailored to the different types of development we have across the city. Plus, it also has a lot more development types of requirements beyond just setbacks and stepbacks that our prior code did. And likewise, some of the plans, including the Willie Street Build Plan, I think were kind of a response to an inadequate zoning ordinance. And so there are a lot of things that are kind of wrapped up in those that we're trying to take our not very good fit zoning code and make it fit better with what we wanted to see. So as far as incorporating some more of those other types of recommendations from the Willie Street Build Plan, I guess I'll let Matt answer that, but I think that's why some of these plans went so far in some of the...
Sorry.
Oh, I'm done.
Yeah, wow, Bill. Following that up, that was like really, really great. I mean, that is absolutely the reason, why we had the zoning that applied to places like East Town and West Town, Middle Point Road, that was the same that applied to Willie Street. And that is exactly why there was some of those, unfortunately, extremely fine-grained plans. I think the challenge with incorporating too many of the build requirements into the zoning code is your zoning code becomes way too prescriptive, and you need variances or exceptions or amendments anytime you have to do something that is a little bit different than an extremely prescriptive requirement that might be what the words are in the bill. The zoning tends to kind of frame out the boundaries of it. A good example is, I think, is the Capital Gateway Corridor UDD 8. The zoning that applies to that area kind of allows everything to happen. It's like a ring outside of it, if that makes sense. And then the fine grain happens through the UDD review. So I don't know how. I mean, I would definitely not want to see something that was so incredibly prescriptive that we in turn would be running into problems constantly with it, or having to continuously amend it. Maybe there are some provisions that could come in. Some of the height things are a little bit complicated too, but I heard there's that idea of kind of like a height overlay, which seems like an interesting alternative to try and get that, because TSS is 3 stories higher by conditional use. So.
Thanks. I appreciate the answers. I think perhaps in public comment, the idea was to keep all of this in the historic preservation ordinance rather than moving it all to the zoning code. But it's food for thought, and I'll think about it. I appreciate the answers. Thanks.
Any other input or comments? Questions? I have not heard enough from commissioners to reach the conclusion that commissioners are supportive of moving this forward as a change in the zoning code. I am looking to see if there's raised hands to say something different with that, but that's what my sense is. Commissioner Cantrell.
Well, I guess I'm generally supportive of this because it provides some clarity for development, and I think this area encompasses that one property that we that a developer wanted to do 3 stories and the neighborhood said, no, it's the plan says 2.5. And so this would at least provide some clarity for that, I think, unless this is not that area that I was thinking about. But so I guess that's at least, I think it provides at least some clarity for me. So thank you.
Thank you. So that would be moving then ahead with these height definitions, but not then with any setbacks. That's
what I would do. That's what I would suggest at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. Alder Rummel.
So I'm remembering now we've had other conversations about adding like height maps and other kinds of zoning layers on some of this. And how does that fit into like this particular piece of that bigger whole? And help me, remind me, maybe it's Heather, like what it is I'm trying to remember that we've talked about, but it seems like there's sort of out there this idea that we, not just that district maps we talked the other day, but maybe more specific things.
Sure. There's a recommendation in the comprehensive plan that we explore extending things like the downtown height map, which only applies to downtown, to areas outside of downtown. And so right now, in most of our zoning districts, and I'll focus on the TSS district, Marcia, which is near and dear to you, I know, and in this area. So the TSS and other districts have a height limit of 3 stories to proceed as a permitted use, and then any height over and above that requires conditional use approval. And so as a plan commission, you see many mixed use proposals that come in at 4 stories, 5 stories. And what we're always doing as staff is looking back at adopted plans to try to glean from them, well, what are the height recommendations in those plans so that we can make a recommendation on whether the proposal before you is consistent with regard to height. And then we look at a variety of other things as well. I think something that the thing that came up in the comprehensive plan and that we're trying to address also here is, what does the Plan Commission want to see some more certainty in sort of an absolute height map like we have downtown, but spread in other areas across the city. So this would be one example of that. What we talked about the other night, the district plans, I think could include that even much more broadly, but this would be just one example and the first example of extending a height map outside of the downtown area and having more certainty with regard to height.
Thank you, Ms. Stouter. Did that get at what you were asking about, Alder Rummel?
I also, I was thinking back to Mr. Tucker's point about Urban Design District 8, and that does have setbacks and stepbacks in it. So that is part of the zoning code. So it's not, unheard of. I guess the policy question, as Alder Heck mentioned, is like, what should go where? And, I think maybe we're still working on that question. I got to tell you, when I asked him, mention the alleys, sure enough, one of my neighborhood historians wrote me right away and said, there was in the bill on page 44, discussion of mid-block alleys as a way to open up and make these connectivity better and, address the development, et cetera. So I'm glad to be vindicated in my, that my brain still bubbles up and useful information.
Okay, so we have one commissioner expressing support for pursuing these height definitions as being a useful clarification and communication. And I would like to hear from other folks. Commissioner Solheim.
Just a quick clarification. If this height map were in the zoning code, if someone was looking at a area in that what would now be basically a 2-story height limit, would they still have the ability to, try and propose a 3-story as part of some sort of conditional use? And we would, be looking back at the 2-story limit as it's just a very large area. And while I think that it's generally appropriate for a lot of that area, there's probably some parcels within there where I think a 3-story makes sense, which is what's making me hesitate. Otherwise, I do like this proposal.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, yes, some of the properties along that southern upside of Williamson Street are currently zoned TSS, which allows for 3 stories by right. So that would probably be the most significant change, where you're actually removing a right that exists today. Let's see. In the downtown area, the only way that a property owner or developer can exceed that height map is through a planned development. And so we could, I guess your question's not fully answered yet, but we could proceed that way, where it would be a planned development would be the only exception to heights shown on the zoning map, and that would probably be the first answer that I would give. I suppose there could be any number of ways of doing it. You could still say that you could pursue something greater by conditional use, but that's already there in the zoning code, and so I don't think that would really be adding anything, any more certainty than what we have today.
Okay. Yeah, that when I was comparing the prior slide of the current allowable heights to this one, and that was the one area that jumped out to me, which does include the project we recently reviewed, I think. So,
and we'll be coming back before you.
Yeah.
I want to just add that.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Spencer.
I just wanted to chime in and say that I am supportive of this because it does offer some clarity and guidance in an area that is facing development pressure, in and near your historic district. So I think it's important to put this guidance out there for clarification. That's it.
Thank you, Commissioner. Alder Rummel.
I don't mean to speak too much, but it did occur to me that maybe I wasn't clear, like that I generally support this, the way that Commissioner Sellers was summarizing what she'd heard, and sounded like only positive summary she thought was at that point from Mr. Cantrell. But so in general, I am supportive. I would like us to study extending and expanding these height zones and reviewing the Build 1, because I think the development pressure it's a historic district all the way, and we should try to acknowledge that. And the other, I know I'd asked Heather about this years ago, and it sort of come up in an earlier discussion we had about zoning a couple times ago, and we talked about, I don't know, I just had this idea for years now. I haven't let go of it yet. Of okay, we have TSS, but what if it were TSS-historic versus just TSS? And then, then you could maybe limit it in ways that we would want to. It's just a thought. I know that the other thing I wanted to mention that strikes me about the light blue on the north side is the build is very clear about the difference between the north side of Willie and the south side of Willie, and that having been historically the more commercial / manufacturing industrial side, and just the historic pattern would seemingly make sense to allow a more height, and I think that's all I got.
Thank you, Alder. Okay, so then I am going to re-summarize with a bit of a difference then here. That it sounds like that in general, commissioners are supportive of moving forward on defining heights consistent with the Willie Street Build 2 program, with Alder Rummel making, I think, the very good point that it's a whole historic district, and there's a build one that also defines heights, and to look at doing the defined heights in essentially the whole historic district. So that's what I'm hearing. This would come back to the commission, but we're looking at following the adopted build plan in terms of heights, and a recommendation coming back to us then. Is that accurate? Seeing no raised hands, I'm going to take that as being accurate, and we will move on because we don't have all that much more time. Explore mapping setbacks and or step backs in Mansion Hill as suggested in the downtown plan. So as Mr. Fruehling pointed out, this has been done along Langdon Street. And then we would be looking at doing it throughout the historic districts based upon the way I'm interpreting it, similar kinds of considerations to what was done in Langdon, looking at what the current buildings are set back from the road in order to come up with these recommended setbacks that would then essentially mirror the pattern of what is in the historic district. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Fruehling. Is that?
You're correct.
Okay. Is there discussion about that? Alder Heck.
Thank you. I'll say that I think this was one of the first pieces of legislation that I sponsored when I became alder, because my predecessor in District 2 did all the heavy lifting on this for Langdon Street. And I think it's been extremely successful, and there have been developments that have been proposed and they follow the new setbacks readily, and I think it's a good thing. I'm still confused why we're doing this when we're primarily talking about height, but I'm supportive.
Thank you. Other comments or questions? Did you have something else, Alder Heck?
No.
Oh, okay. Alder Rummel.
I just have a clarifying question, because I'm hearing say we should do it for Mansion Hill, and Alder Heck said we already did it for Langdon Street. Wasn't there another graphic of the other area? Because is this already done, and we're just saying we're using this example and extending it to a broader, the whole historic district?
Right. The Langdon Street has happened, has been passed by council. And so this would then be applied to the larger historic district.
But yet to be determined on the setbacks, or right, based on a study?
Yes, based on a study, and that would come back then to us.
Sounds like a good idea. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments, input? Seeing none, then I'm going to summarize as go ahead and analyze the whole district in terms of those setback lines. And if there should be any with step backs, let us know that too. I would just observe there are, I had said before, 2 parking lots, but I think there are 3 parking lots in the Mansion Hill Historic District that would potentially be potential for new development. And then, of course, some of the non-contributing properties could also come forward for redevelopment. Less likely so, I would hope, for the historic buildings built during the period of significance. But yes, I think this could be a good thing to do. One question I would have, were you thinking too about side yards setbacks? And would you be looking at that?
The downtown plan in the zoning code only downtown plan recommends this be looked at just the front yard, their street side yard, and the provision, the enabling part of the zoning code just allows for front setbacks and stepbacks.
Okay, so it would be
not side yards, not rear yards.
Okay, so if there were other issues, we would have to look at that separately, is what you're saying. Okay, very good. Then moving on to recommendation 4, delete the definition of height of building in 41.02. And I've got a couple of questions on this. This would mean historic districts would be treated differently then, because the 41.02 would then not apply to all historic districts. Ms. Bailey.
So the definition for height that is currently in the Historic Preservation Ordinance is something that was introduced as part of LORC 1 in an effort to provide clarity about how we're measuring height. A couple of the historic districts provide some specifics about height. University Heights has some specificity about some of the zones. Here's this max height. Here's this max height. Here's this max height. But we didn't have anything in the Historic Preservation Ordinance that specified how are we measuring that height. And by having one definition for how we are measuring height and a different definition for how zoning is measuring height, there's some potential disconnect there. Where we've primarily found it to be problematic is our definition for height is making it difficult for when people are constructing new usable garages in our historic districts. That's where most of we don't have a lot of new construction in our historic districts. Rightly so. That's supposed to, if we have a whole bunch of new construction, there is something very wrong. But in our historic districts, the new construction that we tend to see is for accessory structures for people to have a place to park their cars. By us not using the zoning definition, it's making it where our technical language has made it where the garage that people construct ends up being shorter than what you could construct through zoning. It is still secondary to the principal structure. It also makes it where we can't necessarily do ADUs in the historic districts because of the way that we've framed things out. I think there's the potential for doing that type of adaptive reuse of existing structures or introduction of new accessory structures in our historic districts. There's a lot of caveats there, but the way we currently have it defined is actually, rather than providing a point of clarity, is providing a layer of complication. So one of the things that I had recommended to the Landmarks Ordinance Review Committee is that we have tried this out. We are seeing that there are problems here. We have established definitions through zoning for how we are measuring heights. How about we all be on the same page and use the zoning definitions?
Do you have any concerns, Ms. Bailey, in regard to the fact that the historic district definition measures to the highest point, including the parapet, where the zoning definition does not include that? Is that a concern? That was brought up by one of our submissions that we got.
Right. So, I mean, It could. And there are some ways where we could potentially deal with that. So for a commercial building, if you've got a tall parapet, and people can do some really tall parapets, that can add a significant amount of, feet to the appearance of the building, particularly since we're talking about parapets. People a lot of times have side parapets for a flat roof building, but primarily when you're talking about a parapet in the sense of height that you're getting from the building, you're talking about it being on the front. I think there is the potential for some complications there. That is something we could dig into and talk about if this is something we want to deal with differently in our historic districts. We have one set of problems now, and we can look at going in a different direction and addressing things that might be problematic by heading in a different direction.
My question would be, why not use the definition that is currently in Chapter 41 and simply modify the definition in the zoning code to add the parapet and the language in 41, whichever is higher or to the top of the structure? Would that be an issue? Mr. Tucker, I think, would be the one to answer that, because it's currently, oops, sorry, I hit the wrong button there. Okay, Mr. Tucker.
Sorry about that. I don't know what that definition is in the historic district, Chapter 41. I'd like to take a look at it.
I can read it to you if you want me to.
Sure. This is just for accessory structures. Go ahead.
No, it's not just for accessory structures. It's for all structures.
Ooh.
Yes.
So yeah, parapets are a very tricky thing. There's actually the sign code actually pushes parapets down negatively to avoid over excessive large signs. It's kind of a thing. It's written in the code. It doesn't want you to. It discourages parapets higher than 4 feet. Frankly, it doesn't want you to use the area for signage. So I don't know. I'd be cautious about wanting to look at how that parapet height fits into the equation. You can read it to me. I can.
Well, I mean, for principal buildings is what I'm looking at. For each facade, height is measured from the midpoint of the existing grade to the highest point on the roof, and then the historic district says, or parapet of the building or structure, and then historic district, whichever is higher or to the top of the structure. So it's those phrases that would be added to the current zoning definition.
So that would lower the bulk of the building possibly, because we would be measuring to the top of the parapet as the highest point. There could be unintended consequences by doing that.
Okay.
Remember, we look at the 4 sides of a building, and we're always looking at the highest point. So if you go to the parapet, you've created a new high point, and here's a roof. Right now we measure to that, so now you have a new. I think you have a new high point. I'd have to think about how that works.
Okay, what I am hearing is that it would maybe be a problem to put the historic district definition in the zoning, and Matt wants to think about that more. If that is the case, then it would be changing the historic district definition of height to make to provide for a higher building, is what I'm understanding. Are there commissioner comments about this? Alder Heck.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to explain myself, but I'm thinking about these buildings that we looked at that are on very steep slopes, and what the repercussions would be of adopting the zoning code definition of height. So I'm thinking of, let's think about the Quisling apartments that were one of the examples. would we then be, would there be let's say, God forbid, that building had to be replaced, would there be a change in the allowable height in this for replacing this if we change the definition?
If we're using the zoning definition, this is downtown, and so it has the point of measurement being the entrance. And so that's why we have that picture there on the left-hand side of the screen of point of measurement. This is the height of the building as we've defined it. And hopefully Matt Tucker doesn't give me a violent no for my interpretation there.
And I guess I'd ask what if it was outside downtown?
Then zoning has a different definition for height for the areas outside of downtown.
And so would the parapet then enter in, say, Third Lake Ridge along Willie Street?
Mm-hmm.
Either Ms. Bailey or Mr. Tucker on that? Well, I guess it would be Ms. Bailey.
Say, while Tucker is looking at whatever it is he's looking at, I will say for landmarks review, we don't see a lot of proposals for construction of new principal structures. And again, that's really as it should be. For what Landmarks Commission is looking at for a proposal for new construction. Now, each of the historic districts have different requirements and different sets of standards, but loosely, height is one of the elements, but we're looking at other character defining features on a building for it being in keeping with the character of the other historic resources within the vicinity. So if you have an abnormally tall parapet on the front of your building, that's might not get caught in the height measurement. It's going to get caught elsewhere.
Okay, and I'll just follow up on the outside the downtown. The height measurement is to the highest point on the roof. So that's not a measurement to the parapet. I think that signage thing I described is what drives people to not have overly tall parapets. But we would measure to the roof, not the parapet.
I'm having a hard time hearing you. Usually you come through really loudly, but okay, go ahead.
I don't have a quiet voice usually. I'm not sure what's going on with this thing.
Okay.
Just looking at the definition, they measure to the highest point on the roof. So the parapet is above the roof. So if we switch to measurement of the parapet, 40 feet is going to be to the top of the parapet. You've just lowered the height of the building by measuring to the top of the parapet. So if you're thinking 3 stories and 40 feet, that's going to have a negative impact on the height of the parapet. The parapets are allowed to be taller, but then again, like I said, there's a discouragement in the sign code because you can't use it for signage, which is what parapets typically are used for. Maybe not in historic districts, but typically in commercial buildings, that's what a higher parapet is for.
Alder Heck, are you finished?
I think so. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Sundquist.
Yeah, I guess for what it's worth, my view on this one is a strong yes in terms of making these two measurements consistent. I mean, we had a conversation just on Monday about engaging people. And when we have layers of opaque, different things like height is one thing in one part of our code and a different thing in a different part of the code, it just makes it much harder for people to grasp and participate. Even commissioners, I mean, we have to always ask staff what's going on with, So, I mean, it sounds like the parapet thing isn't a huge issue and would be addressed in other ways in review in historic districts, and that the staff proposal is attractive to me, barring other issues that might come up with it. And there's always the possibility if this new way of measuring in a historic district somehow led to buildings being too tall, then you could adjust the heights in the historic district. But at least then the measures would be consistent from place to place. And I think that's a major process improvement. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Sundquist. I kind of felt the same way about measuring height downtown versus the rest of the city. It would be nice if those were consistent. Okay, so we have a voice saying yes, let's do that. Alder Rummel.
Yeah, I kind of following up what you just said, Commissioner Zellers. I've like the downtown heights versus every other height is not consistent. So, you know, if you're going to then suddenly say consistency is what we need, then my head just spins around, and I guess I'm not ready to decide. It might be the way to go, but I would like a little bit more, because when I started going back to the memo, on definitions, pages away from the other definition, and maybe more of a side by side and some kind of explanation of what it looks like would help me.
Okay, so I hear one commissioner, it's a go ahead, and another commissioner, not so much. Commissioner Solheim.
I don't have a lot to add, just agreeing with Commissioner Sundquist, and that I think that it's nice to have consistency across these two definitions. And I agree that maybe we could expand that consistency to the height definition, but even having it spelled out by staff here, it's still kind of making my head hurt. So I would appreciate having the definitions be the same.
Okay. Commissioner Cantrell.
I guess I agree that we should have consistency in definitions, but could we have, because of this special item for a parapet in a historic district, could we have like a sub D that for parapets in a historic district, this is how it's treated, because it's a little nuance, just like the downtown height is measured in the downtown plan slightly different than in other areas outside the downtown. So I guess that would be my suggestion.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Okay, there's some, not quite consensus on this. What I would like to see or suggest is that staff come back with that in that change in the zoning code to remove then from the landmarks ordinance, and look at incorporating something like Commissioner Cantrell suggested. So to me, that sounds kind of like the best of both worlds. And I would love it if staff would look at making the height definitions consistent across the city, but that's for another day. Are commissioners okay with what I just summarized where we are? Not seeing a hand raised, we will move on. I would like to go to, since we've been talking so much about the heights and we looked at the maps in Mansion Hill, is the concept that I sent out in the memo to commissioners. I do have a big concern about the pressure in the Mansion Hill Historic District on the historic resources. So I was trying to, and I tried to go through the flow in terms of the downtown plan, the comprehensive plan, and why I think that this is something that we should be looking at. And I tried to come up with ideas about how we might be able to address this. And I came up with two options. The historic district average height of the historic resources is actually about 2.5 stories, but let's say 3, but it's closer to 2.5. So we could change the mapping of the height to 3 stories. The other thought I had, because the goal is really to protect our historic resources, is to leave it at 5, but then have something like a footnote, and I would leave it to our experts in zoning on this, a footnote that would limit the height on properties currently housing historic resources, limiting those to the height of the historic resource. That way, it would help relieve the pressure or the impetus, really, to demolish our historic resources. And people might say, well, that just doesn't happen. But almost every home, it seems like, in the Mansion Hill Historic District has at one time or another been proposed for demolition. And it creates a lot of angst, time, expense for everybody working through all of this. I mean, including 2 of the mansions at the corner of Gilman and Pinckney Street. So, you know, things go through a lot of process to then try to protect our historic resources. If we had that height limitation to what's currently on the property of what's there, that would lessen that pressure to some extent and would have more alignment between our goals in the historic district, alignment there with what we have in our zoning code. Because we get developers that come and say, yes, but it says this in the zoning code. And then we have to go through with the whole thing. Yes, but it takes precedent. How is it that it's stated? Conflicting regulations, where the conditions imposed by any provision of this ordinance are either more restrictive or less restrictive than comparable conditions imposed by any other law, ordinance, statute, resolution, or regulation of any kind. The regulations which are more restrictive or which impose higher standards or requirements shall prevail. So the historic district prevails after a lot of time and effort. So my suggestion is get better alignment there with those heights. So you can obviously tell where I come down on this, but what kind of input, commissioners, do you have? Alder Heck.
Thank you. Are there any historic resources greater than 3 stories in Mansion Hill?
Kennedy Manor is.
And Quisling Tower.
Is that within the period of significance?
It's not within the period of significance, but it's a landmark. So
Right.
it's included within the definition. So for historic resources within a historic district, there's a period of significance, and that's the majority of what is considered a historic resource. But under the definition for the historic districts, it also says that landmarks are considered a historic resource. So in Mansion Hill, there are some landmarks that are not within the period of significance, but they're landmarks, so they're considered historic resources.
Thank you for clarifying that, Ms. Bailey.
I think for that reason, I probably lean more towards the second option. But I hear what others have to say.
Thank you, Alder. Commissioner Cantrell.
How would properties be treated that are outside of the period of significance, like those constructed in the 60s and 70s? Would they, if they were 5 stories, they could be constructed and the area would stay 5 stories, with the exception of this footnote or that you've read that would be a number 2?
Correct. That's my concept is. So anything outside of the period of significance would remain as it is now, basically.
Okay. And that section of the downtown plan that talks about the old uglies and replacing those, that would be still consistent with the downtown plan concept of the treatment of those buildings, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Well, I think this has some merit.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Solheim.
Thank you for putting this together, Chair Zellers. And I do think I'm leaning towards the second option with the footnote, but I would like to take a look at this further. I mean, I think it makes sense just as we look at the map in terms of what's there currently and how the vast majority is close to this height. I think, if we went forward with taking a look at this, I'd like to look at maybe a few specific parcels that may be outliers, but overall, I like the concept.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Cantrell, did you have something else?
Yeah, I have one other question. How would buildings, and maybe we don't have any in this area, how would buildings that are in the period of significance, the 1840 to 1930, but are there any that have been remodeled so much that they're non-contributing?
So we don't do contributing and non-contributing. That is a National Register concept. We have period of significance. You're in the period of significance or you're not in the period of significance.
Okay.
And in terms of being remodeled, one of the things with rehabilitation is you can take some steps to correct some previous errors in what you have done to a building to bring it back into something that is more period appropriate to the historic character of the given building.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any other? Alder Rummel.
I'm interested in what Commissioner Solheim talked about studying more, because I generally would want to lean towards one, but I worry that would just create a lot of outcry and drama and angst, whereas number 2 seems maybe it kind of gets to the same outcome. But so, not that I'm political or anything, but just something but I would like to know more about 1 before I say, yeah, I lean towards 2, but I want to know more about 1, what that looks like. Thank you.
I don't see any other raised hands. I'm going to try to summarize, and please, again, jump in. There is support for going this direction and doing something, either 1 or 2. And the sentiment seems to be leaning toward number 2, but wanting to see some specifics, I guess I would say, from what Commissioner Solheim said. And so I then would direct staff to go ahead and explore this, come back to us with this concept and some examples. Is that, seeing no raised hands, then the last item that we have is the first settlement recommendation. Or it didn't really come through as a recommendation, but almost. And that is to apply some buffer, I guess I would say, between the 3-story heights and the 6-story to provide some transition, much like is done in UDD 8 to try to do Urban Design District 8 to try to provide some transition between the taller buildings and the more modest neighborhood houses. So are there any questions about this concept? Okay, Alder Heck.
Thank you. My thought was, why wouldn't we do the same along East Washington where the 10-story adjacent parcel is allowed? I realize that's, that's 10 stories next to historic resources that are only 3 stories. And I mean, as has been alluded to by Alder Rummel, I've discussed with others, I would like to see this kind of provision all along East Washington extended up to the Capitol to avoid what we went through with the 400 block. But just curious why we wouldn't include that. I
would suggest that that's for another time.
Yes.
That's not a historic district. I agree with you. We need to do something about that. But we don't have really much more time. So I would like to kind of wrap this up, but I think that that's a very good suggestion. And I think we should take that under consideration too.
But I am concerned about those 10 next, the part of first settlement next to those 10 stories.
And I know we're about out of time, but that's the Brayton lot. So it's a big surface parking lot, and that is following the recommendation of a really old plan, the Brayton lot development plan. And so that was thought that would probably be more of a unified development, but there aren't any buildings where it says 4 stories.
Yeah, I'm concerned about the 3 stories next to the 10 stories, but I realize, but I'm not opposed to the area that's hatched right now. That seems like a good idea.
Alder Rummel.
I think to me, my question's different. I've been watching developers try to redevelop this Essen House parcel for more than the time that I've been Alder. Okay, so will be 15 plus years probably, to at least. And the last go around, I had an epiphany. So we had a really good developer, but they just couldn't get it right. And I realized that having the East Wilson National Register District not be in the local landmark district is a problem. And that's one reason nothing ever seems to happen here, because they want to build into, they want to tear stuff down and then build into the historic district. And you're crossing a line of a historic district. And all the rules change. And it just messed up that last project. I mean, it had other issues, but that was, I think, the blow that just did it in. The 6 stories on East Wilson on the north side sends a message to the property owner, at least one of them, that we can just tear down these National Register resources. And I don't think the neighborhood wants that. I don't think as as a city, we should say that these are redevelopable parcels, which you say, again, signaling developers, when you say 6 stories, I know that this was a downtown plan decision. I didn't support it at the time, and I still don't support it. So to me, like, while that 30-degree transition seems to make sense, I believe that the last developer did that in their proposal. I mean, they kind of stepped it back. They gave some breathing room between the back of those condos along, I guess it's Franklin, whatever street it is, Hancock, whatever the one it is. But it just still didn't work.
So you're saying that you think that there needs to be more work on this to solve the issues that are being encountered here. Is that a summary?
I mean, I guess you could say that's a good idea, but I don't know that it will mean anything will ever happen here until you get to these more fundamental issues of this boundary that the one property owner crosses a boundary, and how do you resolve that? And this is the commercial district of one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city. And, it could be reinvested in, and it could be added on to, do some facades. But, at some point where the boundary is between the historic district and the non-historic district just creates kind of issues.
Thank you, Alder. Commissioner Solheim.
Alder Rummel kind of answered my question for me. I was going to ask her if she could chime in on if this change kind of proactively addressed some of the things that have come up on recent proposals here, because there have been a lot. But, I'm kind of hesitant about this one, just because I'm not sure if it helps or if it just adds another layer of another design consideration that you need to take into account when looking at this whole area. It's already extremely complicated, and I think that most developers experienced in working in this area would probably make that design change anyway to appease some of the neighbors. So I'm not really sure if it adds anything besides another layer of something to look at when considering this parcel.
Okay. Thank you very much, Commissioner. We have tried to stay pretty close to our 8 o'clock cutoff on all of the other big picture special meetings, and I'm going to do that on this one too. And I'm going to say that this one, based on the little bit we did here, needs more work, more thought in terms of if there's something that can be done to help in this problem that, as Alder Rummel said, has come up over and over again. Is that a fair assessment of this one? Okay. I'm going to ask Ms. Bailey, Ms. Stouter then. Did you, and Mr. Fruling, did you get enough information on the ones that we did conclude on, that the direction to be taken?
I think I do. It was
okay.
Great discussion, and I appreciate it.
Okay. And thank you very much, and your cohorts, for all the work that you did on putting together these maps and the definitions and the comprehensive, all the information that you put together. It was enormously helpful. So thank you. Anything else from commissioners? We do have any special items of business? Any business by members? Seeing none, I would be looking for a motion to adjourn. So moved by Commissioner Cantrell. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Solheim. Thank you, and happy holidays to all of you. And thank you for your work on this. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. See you next year.
Okay.